What if the person who shaped your future lost everything while you became a global superstar? When seven-time Formula One world champion Lewis Hamilton spots his long-lost karting mentor in a crowd at Silverstone, he discovers Terry Wilson is now stocking supermarket shelves after losing everything in the 2008 housing crisis. Their emotional reunion sets in motion a plan bigger than either could imagine, one that might save Terry's life. Terry Wilson pulled his worn jacket tighter as the wind swept across the Rye House kart circuit. The small racing track in Hertfordshire wasn't much, but on weekends it came alive with the buzz of kart engines and excited kids. Terry had been coaching here for 15 years, ever since his own racing dreams had faded away. Another Saturday, another batch of rich kids playing racer, Terry muttered to himself as he watched the newest group of parents unloading expensive carts from shiny trailers. That's when he spotted them. A man and a young boy struggling with a beaten-up cart that had clearly seen better days. The father worked quickly, his hands rough and calloused, while the boy, no more than 8 years old, bounced on his toes with excitement. Terry wandered over, curiosity getting the better of him. "First time here?" Terry asked, noticing how the man's clothes were clean but worn at the edges. "Lewis has raced a few times," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Anthony Hamilton. This is my son, Lewis." The boy looked up with bright eyes that sparkled with determination. "I'm going to be a Formula One champion someday." Terry smiled. He'd heard that claim from dozens of kids before, but something about the way Lewis said it, like it was already a fact just waiting to happen, made Terry pause. "Well then, let's see what you've got, future champion." When Lewis Hamilton took to the track that day in 1993, Terry couldn't believe his eyes. The boy was a natural, finding racing lines that grown men missed. He was small for his age, but he handled the kart like it was an extension of himself. "Where did you learn to drive like that?" Terry asked when Lewis pulled in after his session. "My dad gives me toy cars. I study how they should move," Lewis said simply. Anthony stood nearby, pride battling with worry on his face. "He's got talent, hasn't he? But these weekends, they're not cheap." Terry learned that Anthony worked multiple jobs, sometimes 3 at once, to fund Lewis's racing. The kart was second-hand, the helmet was on its 3rd owner, and the racing suit was too big. "I'll tell you what," Terry said suddenly, surprising himself. "I can give Lewis some coaching, no charge." Anthony's expression turned suspicious. "Why would you do that?" "Because in 30 years of racing and coaching, I've never seen a kid with this much raw talent," Terry said honestly. "It would be a crime not to develop it." That was the beginning. Every weekend, while other coaches worked with kids whose parents paid top dollar, Terry spent hours with Lewis. They worked on braking points, racing lines, and overtaking techniques. But Terry taught Lewis more than just racing. "Racing isn't just about being fast," Terry explained one day as they walked the track. "It's about respect for your competitors, for the track, for the sport." Lewis soaked up every word, asking questions that kids twice his age wouldn't think to ask. By the time Lewis was 9, he was winning races against boys much older. The other coaches started to notice, and so did the karting community. "You've found yourself a special one there," Martin Hines, the owner of the famous Zip kart team, told Terry one day. "He's going all the way to Formula One," Terry replied with certainty. As Lewis continued to win races, Anthony's financial struggle grew harder. Terry often found ways to help without making it obvious. A spare set of tires that he didn't need anymore. Entry fees that were mysteriously discounted. "I can't keep accepting your help," Anthony said one evening as they packed up after a winning race. "You're not accepting anything," Terry insisted. "I'm investing in the future. One day, when Lewis is famous, I'll get to say I spotted him first. The bond between Terry and Lewis grew stronger with each passing month. When Lewis struggled with reading in school, Terry brought racing magazines to help him practice. When bullies at school made fun of Lewis for his size, Terry taught him that the smallest drivers often had the advantage in karts. "They can laugh now," Terry told him, "but one day they'll be asking for your autograph." The first major test came at the British Cadet Karting Championship when Lewis was 10. The competition was fierce, with kids from wealthy families sporting the best equipment money could buy. Lewis's kart was still second-hand, patched up with parts that Anthony had found deals on. Before the race, Terry saw doubt creep into Lewis's eyes for the first time. "Their karts are so much newer," Lewis whispered. Terry knelt down to eye level with the boy. "Lewis, remember what I told you about racing in the rain?" Lewis nodded. "The rain is the great equalizer. It's not about the equipment then. It's about the driver. Well, today, your talent is going to be the equalizer," Terry said firmly. "I believe in you." The race was a masterclass. Lewis started in 8th position but carved through the field with precision that belied his age. With 2 laps to go, he made a bold move on the outside of a corner to take the lead. When Lewis crossed the finish line first, Anthony lifted his son high in the air, tears streaming down his face. The Hamilton family had sacrificed everything for moments like this. Terry stood back, watching the celebration. His own eyes weren't exactly dry either. Later, as they loaded the winning cart into Anthony's van, Lewis ran up and threw his arms around Terry's waist. "Thank you for believing in me," the boy said. Terry ruffled Lewis's hair. "This is just the beginning, champ. Just the beginning." As the van pulled away, Terry had no idea how right he was. He couldn't know that the small boy with the big dreams would indeed reach Formula One. He couldn't foresee how their paths would diverge and then cross again under circumstances neither could imagine. All Terry knew that day in 1993 was that he had found something special, a raw talent that came along once in a generation. And for now, that was enough. 5 years flew by in a blur of trophies, early mornings, and the constant smell of racing fuel. Lewis Hamilton was no longer the small boy with big dreams. He was becoming the young man Terry always knew he could be. It was a crisp autumn day in 1998 when everything changed. Terry arrived at the track to find an unusual number of people gathered around the Hamiltons' modest setup. "What's all this about?" Terry asked, squeezing through the crowd. Anthony Hamilton's face was a mixture of pride and something else. Worry, perhaps. "They want Lewis," Anthony said quietly, nodding toward 2 men in McLaren team jackets. "McLaren wants him for their young driver program." Terry's heart skipped a beat. McLaren was one of the top Formula One teams in the world. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. The taller of the 2 men stepped forward. "Ron Dennis," he said, extending his hand to Terry. "You've done remarkable work with the boy." Terry shook the man's hand, trying to process what was happening. Ron Dennis, the boss of McLaren F1, was here at a karting track talking about Lewis. "He's done the work himself," Terry managed to say. "I just pointed him in the right direction." Later that day, after the McLaren men had left with promises and contracts, Lewis found Terry sitting alone by the now quiet track. "They want me to move to their training facility," Lewis said, his voice caught between excitement and uncertainty. "I'll be working with their coaches and engineers." Terry nodded slowly. "This is what we've been working toward, Lewis. This is your shot." "But what about you?" Lewis asked. "You're my coach." Terry put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "Not anymore. You're moving up to the big leagues now." That night, Terry couldn't sleep. He should have been overjoyed. His protege was on the path to Formula One, just as they had dreamed. but a selfish part of him ached at the thought of the empty spot in his weekends where Lewis had been. The next few years brought occasional phone calls and Christmas cards. Terry followed Lewis's progress through racing magazines and televised events. Formula Renault, Formula 3, GP2, Lewis climbed the ladder with remarkable speed, winning championships at every level. Terry made a point of attending the British rounds whenever he could afford the tickets. He would stand in the crowd, bursting with pride, as the racing publications hailed Lewis as the next big thing and Britain's rising star. The phone calls became less frequent. The Christmas cards stopped coming. Terry understood. Lewis was busy living the life they had planned together, surrounded by professionals and new mentors who could take him further than a simple karting coach ever could. In 2007, the dream finally came true. Lewis Hamilton, just 22 years old, made his Formula One debut with McLaren. Terry splurged on a new television just to watch the race. "That's my boy," he whispered, as Lewis lined up on the grid in Australia for his very first Grand Prix. Lewis didn't just participate, he shined, finishing on the podium in his first race, winning races in his rookie season, and coming within a single point of being world champion. It was unprecedented. Terry sent a congratulatory message through McLaren's public relations department after Lewis's first win. He never knew if it reached him. The 2008 season was even more dramatic. Lewis fought for the championship against Felipe Massa right down to the final race in Brazil. Terry couldn't bear to watch it at home. He scraped together every penny he had saved and bought a ticket to Brazil, maxing out his credit card for the flight. The rain in São Paulo was torrential as Terry found his seat in the grandstand. His heart pounded with every lap. With just a few corners to go in the final race, it looked like Lewis had lost the championship. "Come on, Lewis," Terry muttered, his hands clenched tight. "One more pass. You can do it." As if hearing his old mentor's words, Lewis made an impossible overtake. On the second-to-last corner of the final lap, he crossed the line in 5th place, just enough to win the World Championship by a single point. The crowd erupted. Terry found himself swept up in a tide of emotion and celebration. Somehow, he made his way toward the paddock, hoping against hope for a moment with his former student. He caught a glimpse of Lewis surrounded by the McLaren team, champagne spraying everywhere, cameras flashing. The security guard stopped Terry at the barrier. "I'm a friend," Terry tried to explain. "I coached him when he was a boy." The guard shook his head. "Everyone's a friend today, mate. No pass, no entry." Terry stood there as the celebration continued, watching Lewis, now a world champion, being embraced by Ron Dennis, Anthony, and a circle of team members, new mentors, new family. After a while, Terry turned and made his way back through the crowd. Lewis had reached the pinnacle they had dreamed about on those cold mornings at the karting track. That should have been enough. But as he walked away from the circuit, leaving the sounds of celebration behind, Terry couldn't help feeling that something important had been left unfinished between them. Terry returned to England with mixed emotions. The thrill of seeing Lewis win the championship battled with the ache of feeling like a stranger to the young man he had once mentored. But life didn't pause for such feelings. There were bills to pay and a future to plan. Over the years since discovering Lewis, Terry had made some smart investments. After coaching several children from wealthy families, he had saved enough to buy a small house near London in 2001. By 2007, he owned 4 rental properties, nothing fancy, just modest homes that provided steady income. At 58, Terry was thinking about retirement. His plan was solid. The rent from these properties would support him comfortably in his later years. The property market only goes up, his financial advisor had assured him. Especially in London. The first sign of trouble came in late 2007, when one of his tenants, a banker named James, lost his job. "I'm sorry, Terry," James said when he called. "The bank is cutting back. Something about American mortgages. I'll have to move out next month." Terry wasn't worried at first. Good rentals in London never stayed empty for long. But by February 2008, James's house was still vacant. And now the news was full of terms like subprime mortgages and credit crunch. Banks that had seemed as solid as mountains were suddenly teetering. "It's just a blip," Terry told himself as he watched the financial news. "The market will recover." By summer, 2 more of his properties were empty. His tenants, a young couple, who both worked in finance and a single mother employed by a mortgage company, had all lost their jobs. The rent payments stopped, but the mortgage bills kept coming. Terry sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by bills, as the television played in the background. The news showed long lines outside Northern Rock banks. Ordinary people desperately trying to withdraw their savings. It was the first British bank run in over a century. The global financial crisis deepened today, the news anchor said gravely, as Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Experts warn this could trigger a domino effect across global markets. Terry stared at the figures on his bank statement. His savings were draining fast as he covered 3 empty properties. And now the banks were calling in loans early and raising interest rates on his remaining mortgage. "It's temporary," the local estate agent said, when Terry tried to sell one of the properties. "But I have to be honest, you'll take a loss if you sell now." Values have dropped nearly 20% since last year. 20%. The number hit Terry like a physical blow. That was over $60,000 on each property. Money he didn't have. By Christmas 2008, as Lewis celebrated his world championship, Terry was forced to sell 2 properties at massive losses just to keep the bank from foreclosing on the others. His retirement savings were gone, swallowed by the difference between what he owed and what the houses were now worth. The television showed images of Lewis at an awards ceremony, smiling in an expensive suit while accepting another trophy. Terry quickly changed the channel. 2009 brought no relief. The property market continued to fall. Banks tightened lending even further. And now, Terry's own job was at risk as parents cut back on luxuries like racing lessons for their children. One rainy Tuesday in March, Terry received the letter he had been dreading. The bank was foreclosing on his remaining properties, including his own home. The letter used cold, formal language to tell him he had 30 days to vacate the house he had lived in for 15 years. That night, Terry did something he hadn't done in years. He cried. Pride kept Terry from reaching out to old friends for help. He told no one as he packed up his belongings, selling what he could, and storing the rest in a small rented garage. His racing trophies and memorabilia, including several photos with young Lewis, went into a special box that he couldn't bear to part with. "Dad, you can't live in your car," his daughter Claire said when she finally discovered how bad things had gotten. "You're moving in with us. No arguments." Claire lived in a small 3-bedroom house in Essex with her husband Tom and their 2 children. The spare room was tiny, barely large enough for a single bed and a small dresser, but it was a roof over his head. "It's just until I get back on my feet," Terry promised, as Claire helped him carry his few remaining possessions into the room. But getting back on his feet proved harder than expected. Jobs were scarce in the aftermath of the financial crisis, especially for a man in his 60s who had spent his life in racing. Terry applied for positions as a driving instructor, security, guard, and even a school janitor, but the rejection letters piled up. By 2010, Terry had been forced to accept a part-time job stocking shelves at a local supermarket. It paid enough to contribute something to Claire's household and maintain his dignity, but little more. His credit was ruined, his savings gone, and his dream of a comfortable retirement had vanished like morning mist. One evening, as Terry sat with Claire's family watching television, a Formula One race appeared on screen. Lewis Hamilton, now driving car number 4 for McLaren, was leading the race. "That's him, isn't it?" Claire asked quietly. "The boy you used to coach." Terry nodded silently. "Have you tried contacting him?" "Maybe he could." "No!" Terry cut her off firmly. "That was another lifetime ago. He's moved on. So have I." After the race, when everyone else had gone to bed, Terry found himself looking up Lewis's recent races on Claire's computer. Lewis hadn't won the championship since 2008, but he was still winning races, still considered one of the best drivers in the world. Articles mentioned Lewis's multi-million-pound salary, his luxurious homes in Monaco and London, his celebrity friends. In one photo, Lewis stood next to his private jet, smiling at the camera. Terry closed the computer and went to bed. As he lay in the darkness of the small spare room, surrounded by his grandchildren's old toys, he thought about how differently their lives had turned out. Lewis had reached the stars, while Terry had lost everything. He didn't blame Lewis, not at all. But as he drifted off to sleep, Terry wondered if Lewis ever thought about the man who had first spotted his talent on that cold morning at Rye House Kart Circuit so many years ago. While Terry struggled with the aftermath of the financial crisis, Lewis Hamilton's life moved at racing speed. After winning the championship in 2008, Lewis expected more titles to follow quickly. But Formula One was never that simple. In 2009, his McLaren car wasn't fast enough to compete for wins regularly. Lewis fought hard for every point, but finished a distant 5th in the championship. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever win another title," Lewis confided to his father Anthony after a particularly frustrating race in 2010. The pressure was immense. Being a champion meant everyone expected more championships. The British press, once so supportive, now questioned his focus and commitment. They criticized his lifestyle, his famous friends, even his clothes. By 2012, Lewis felt stuck. His McLaren team was strong but not dominant. Sebastian Vettel and Red Bull Racing were winning everything. Lewis needed a change. When Lewis announced he was leaving McLaren to join Mercedes in 2013, the racing world was shocked. Mercedes had returned to Formula One as a team in 2010, but they weren't winning races consistently. "He's throwing his career away," one famous commentator said on television. "Mercedes will never beat Red Bull." Lewis watched these comments with a quiet determination. He had made his decision based on instinct, the same instinct that had helped him overtake cars on the racetrack since he was a boy. His first season with Mercedes in 2013 was challenging. One win, a handful of podiums, but nothing like the success he craved. Meanwhile, Sebastian Vettel won his 4th straight championship. But behind the scenes, Mercedes was building something special. They were preparing for a major change in rules coming in 2014, new hybrid engines that would transform the sport. Through the challenging times, Lewis sometimes found himself thinking about his early days in racing. The pure joy of driving a kart around Rye House. The simple focus on speed without the politics and pressure of Formula One. One quiet evening in his Monaco apartment, Lewis opened an old box of racing mementos. Inside was a faded photograph. Young Lewis, maybe 10 years old, standing proudly beside Terry after winning a karting race. Lewis held the photo for a long time. Terry's proud smile took him back to simpler days. He wondered what his old mentor was doing now. In the chaos of his Formula One career, They had lost touch completely. Lewis thought about reaching out, but what would he say after all these years? "Sorry I disappeared when I made it big." The moment passed, and the photo went back in the box. The 2014 season changed everything for Lewis. Mercedes had built an incredible car with a dominant engine. Suddenly, Lewis was winning races easily, fighting only with his teammate Nico Rosberg. As the victories piled up, Lewis felt his confidence returning. By the final race in Abu Dhabi, he secured his second world championship, 6 years after his first. Standing on the podium, spraying champagne as the British anthem played, Lewis felt a fullness in his heart, but also a strange emptiness. He had everything he'd ever wanted: fame, fortune, championship trophies. His garage held a collection of supercars worth millions. He owned luxurious homes in Monaco, London, and Colorado. He traveled by private jet and socialized with movie stars and musicians, but something was missing. After the championship celebration, Lewis found a quiet corner away from the team party. He called his father. "Dad, do you remember all the people who helped us in the early days?" Lewis asked. "The mechanics who fixed my cart for free? The sponsors who gave us discounted tires?" "Of course," Anthony replied. "We wouldn't be here without them." "I've been thinking about Terry a lot," Lewis admitted. "Do you ever hear from him?" There was a pause on the line. "No," Anthony said finally. "Not for many years." The conversation stayed with Lewis for days afterward. As his celebrity grew, so did his awareness of his platform. He began speaking out about causes he believed in: diversity in racing, environmental issues, animal rights, but still, the thought of Terry lingered. One of the most important mentors in his life had simply faded away, and Lewis had let it happen. In early 2015, as Lewis prepared to defend his title, he instructed his assistant to try and find contact information for Terry Wilson. But with no social media presence and a common name, Terry proved difficult to track down. "Keep trying," Lewis insisted. "He was important to me." The search continued without success, as Lewis focused on racing. The 2015 season brought more victories, another championship, and increasing fame. Lewis was now one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. As 2016 approached, Lewis made a decision to visit the Rye House kart circuit during the off-season. Maybe someone there would know how to find Terry. But before he could make the trip, the racing season began, and Lewis was once again caught in the whirlwind of competition, media commitments, and global travel. The connection remained unmade, the circle unclosed, until fate stepped in at Silverstone in the summer of 2018. The British Grand Prix at Silverstone was always special for Lewis Hamilton. Racing in front of his home crowd gave him extra energy. By 2018, he had won the race 5 times, a record he shared with the legendary Jim Clark and Alain Prost. "This is where it feels most real," Lewis told reporters at the Thursday press conference. "Driving past those grandstands filled with British flags, knowing those people have been saving up all year to be here. It reminds me of when I was a kid, dreaming of racing in Formula One." What Lewis didn't know was that in a modest home in Essex, Terry Wilson was staring at a small envelope in disbelief. "Happy birthday, Dad," Claire said, watching her father's reaction with a smile. Inside the envelope were 2 tickets to the British Grand Prix, grandstand seats for Saturday's qualifying session. "Claire, these must have cost a fortune," Terry protested. "Tom and I have been saving a little each month. Since Christmas," she said. "Your 70th birthday deserves something special." Terry felt tears threatening. After 8 difficult years, Things had finally stabilized. He had a full-time job as a supervisor at the supermarket now. He contributed to Claire's household, expenses, and had even started a small savings account. But luxuries like Formula One tickets were still far beyond his reach. "Thank you," he whispered, hugging his daughter tightly. Saturday morning was perfect racing weather, clear skies with a light breeze. Terry felt like a child as they approached the circuit, the sound of racing engines growing louder. His heart beat faster as they found their seats in the Luffield grandstand. Lewis Hamilton currently leads the championship by 1 point over Sebastian Vettel. The announcer's voice boomed across the circuit. He'll be looking for pole position today at his home race. As the cars took to the track for practice, Terry found himself automatically analyzing driving lines, just as he had done when coaching young racers. "Look at that," he said to Claire, pointing as Lewis's silver Mercedes swept through the corner in front of them. "See how smooth he is? No wasted movement. That's what I always told him. Smooth is fast." Claire smiled, happy to see her father's enthusiasm. It had been years since she'd seen him this animated. After the practice session, Claire suggested they visit the F1 fan zone. "There's an autograph session with some of the drivers," she said. "Maybe we'll get lucky." Terry agreed, though he doubted they'd get close to any drivers. The fan zone was packed with thousands of people wearing team merchandise. Children sat on parents' shoulders. Fans held out caps and programs, hoping for signatures. "It's too crowded," Terry said after 20 minutes of being jostled in the crowd. "Let's head back to our seats." As they turned to leave, a huge cheer erupted from the crowd. Lewis Hamilton had arrived at the autograph area, surrounded by team personnel and security guards. Despite himself, Terry stopped and turned back. Through gaps in the crowd, he caught glimpses of Lewis, now a 4-time world champion and global superstar, signing autographs and taking selfies with fans. "He looks exactly the same," Terry murmured. Still that same focus in his eyes. Claire heard the emotion in her father's voice. "Dad, let's try to get closer. You should say hello." Terry shook his head firmly. No. He won't remember me." It was a lifetime ago, but Claire was already gently pulling him through the crowd, excusing herself as they moved forward. Somehow, they managed to reach the second row of fans, just a few feet from where Lewis was signing autographs. Terry's heart pounded. He should say something, wave, try to catch Lewis's attention, but pride kept him silent. What if Lewis didn't remember him? Or worse, what if he remembered but didn't care? Lewis moved efficiently along the line, making sure to connect briefly with each fan. He was about to move on when something made him pause. A familiar face in the crowd. Not shouting or waving like the others, just watching quietly with an expression Lewis hadn't seen in years but somehow never forgot. Their eyes met across the short distance. Lewis tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to place a half-remembered song. Then his eyes widened in recognition. "Terry," Lewis said, barely audible over the crowd noise. "Terry Wilson!" Terry could only nod, his throat suddenly tight. The security guards were already moving Lewis along, but he stopped dead in his tracks. "Wait," Lewis said firmly. Then louder, "Wait!" The crowd hushed at the urgency in his voice. The security guards froze. Without hesitation, Lewis stepped away from the autograph table and pushed through the barrier. Cameras flashed as he moved directly to where Terry stood. "It's you," Lewis said, his voice filled with wonder. "I can't believe it's really you." Before Terry could respond, Lewis threw his arms around him in a tight hug. The crowd, confused but excited by the drama, began to cheer. Security guards looked at each other uncertainly. This wasn't in the protocol. When Lewis finally released him, Terry saw that the young man's eyes were wet with tears. "I've been trying to find you," Lewis said, oblivious to the cameras and murmuring crowd. "For years, I've been trying to find you." Terry couldn't find words. This wasn't how he had imagined their reunion, if he had dared imagine one at all. Claire stood beside them, hand over her mouth, watching the scene unfold. "Sir, we need to keep moving," a security guard said urgently in Lewis's ear. Lewis nodded but didn't take his eyes off Terry. "You're coming with me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't have a pass," Terry protested weakly. Lewis laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that reminded Terry of the boy he once knew. "I'm Lewis Hamilton. You don't need a pass if you're with me." With that, he placed his arm around Terry's shoulders and turned to the security team. "This man is my special guest for the weekend. Please arrange full access credentials immediately." The head of security nodded quickly, speaking into his radio. "My daughter," Terry said, finding his voice and gesturing to Claire. "She bought the tickets. She's the reason I'm here." Lewis extended his hand to Claire. "Thank you," he said with complete sincerity. "You have no idea what you've done today." As Lewis led them through the barriers into the restricted area, fans called out and cameras followed their every move. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the emotional reunion. Who is that man? Why did Hamilton hug him? Did you see Lewis cry? The questions spread across the internet, but Lewis paid no attention. He guided Terry and Claire through the paddock toward the Mercedes garage, stopping occasionally to introduce them to stunned team members. "This is Terry Wilson," he would say with pride. "He taught me everything I know about racing. He's the reason I'm here today." Inside the Mercedes hospitality area, away from the crowds and cameras, Lewis finally sat down across from Terry. "Have a qualifying session to prepare for," Lewis said, checking his watch. "But I want you to watch it from our garage. And afterward, we have a lot to talk about." Terry nodded, still overwhelmed by the turn of events. 10 years, Lewis said, quietly. 10 years, I've wondered where you were. And then you just appear in the crowd, like magic. "Not magic," Terry replied with a small smile. "Just a birthday present from my daughter." Lewis shook his head in amazement. "The universe works in strange ways." He stood up, duty calling. "I'll see you after qualifying. Don't disappear on me." Again, Terry Wilson. As Lewis walked away to prepare for his session, Terry turned to Claire, his face a mixture of shock and joy. "Did that really just happen?" he asked. Claire squeezed his hand. "Happy birthday, Dad." Watching Lewis Hamilton win pole position from inside the Mercedes garage was an experience Terry would never forget. The team's celebration was intense but focused. These were professionals who expected success, but still cherished each victory. "He's always been special in the rain," Terry commented, as Lewis mastered the suddenly wet track with skill that left his rivals seconds behind. A Mercedes engineer glanced at Terry with newfound respect. "You really do know him, don't you?" After the session, Lewis found Terry and Claire waiting in his private area of the Mercedes motorhome. Despite the demands on his time, Lewis had insisted they stay. "I have media duties," Lewis explained apologetically. "But I've arranged for you to have dinner here tonight. Will you wait?" Terry nodded, still somewhat dazed by how quickly his life had changed in the past few hours. When Lewis finally returned 2 hours later, he had changed from his racing suit into casual designer clothes that probably cost more than Terry earned. In 3 months? But his smile was the same one Terry remembered from the karting days, genuine and full of life. "I can't believe you're really here," Lewis said, as they sat down to dinner. "When did you stop coaching?" "About 5 years ago," Terry replied, carefully avoiding the reasons why. "The sport changed. Everything became so expensive." Lewis nodded. "Karting costs a fortune now. Most families can't afford it without big sponsors." As they talked, Lewis kept looking at Terry with a puzzled expression. Finally, he said what was on his mind. "Terry, don't take this the wrong way, but you look tired." Claire shot her father a meaningful glance. Terry knew what she was thinking. It was time for honesty. "Life hasn't been easy these past 10 years," Terry admitted quietly. Lewis leaned forward, his championship forgotten for the moment. "What happened? Please tell me," Terry sighed. "How do you tell a multimillionaire superstar that you've been stocking supermarket shelves and living in your daughter's spare room?" "I made some investments," Terry began slowly. "Rental properties. They were doing well until the financial crisis," Lewis finished for him, understanding dawning on his face. Terry nodded. "I lost everything in 2008 and 2009, the same year you won your first championship." Lewis's expression grew serious. "Everything?" "The properties, my savings, eventually my own house," Terry confirmed, looking down at his plate. "I moved in with Claire and her family. Been there ever since." The silence that followed was heavy. Claire reached over and squeezed her father's hand again. "Why didn't you try to contact me?" Lewis asked finally, his voice tight with emotion. Terry looked up, meeting Lewis's eyes directly. "What was I supposed to say?" "Congratulations on your championship, by the way. I'm bankrupt?" "You were building your career. You had new people around you. Better people." "Not better," Lewis said firmly. "Never better." He shook his head. "I should have kept in touch. After everything you did for me." "You were busy becoming a champion," Terry said. "That was the plan all along." Lewis stood up suddenly and walked to the window, looking out at the circuit now bathed in evening light. "I thought about you," he said without turning around. "All these years, I thought about you. I kept meaning to find you, to reconnect. But there was always another race, another season." His voice trailed off. When Lewis turned back, his expression was determined. "Where are you working now?" Terry felt a flash of embarrassment but pushed it aside. "Sainsbury's. I'm a department supervisor." He saw Lewis trying to hide his shock and felt a flicker of pride. "It's honest work. I pay my way in Claire's house." "Dad's still the hardest worker I know," Claire added. "He walks 3 miles to work each day to save bus fare." Lewis nodded slowly, noticing Terry's worn shoes for the first time. "And you spent money on Grand Prix tickets?" Claire blushed. "It's his 70th birthday. We saved up." Lewis sat back down, leaning forward with intensity. "Terry, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." He paused. "Are you happy?" The question caught Terry off guard. He'd expected offers of money, which he'd already decided to refuse. But happiness? That required honesty. "I'm content," he said carefully. "I have my family. I have my health." He paused. "But do I miss my old life? The racing world? Every single day?" Lewis nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "What? About your racing memorabilia? Your trophies?" Lewis asked. Terry looked away. This was harder to admit. "I sold most of it," he said quietly. "When things got really bad in 2010, medical bills, Claire's husband had an accident, couldn't work for 3 months." Lewis's expression changed. Terry couldn't. Quite read it. Sadness? Anger? Determination? "What about our photos? The ones from your coaching days?" Terry smiled slightly. "Those I kept. They're in a box under my bed. Some things you don't sell no matter what." Something shifted in Lewis's face then. A decision being made. "I'm racing tomorrow," he said. "The British Grand Prix. I want you both watching from the garage with my family." "Lewis, we couldn't possibly," Terry began. "Please," Lewis interrupted. "It would mean everything to me." How could Terry refuse? The boy he had once coached was now a man asking for his support. "We'll be there," Terry promised. Lewis smiled, then checked his watch. "I should let you get back to your hotel. Tomorrow's a big day." Terry and Claire exchanged a quick glance. "We're not staying at a hotel," Claire explained. "We're driving back to Essex tonight. It's only 2 hours." Lewis stared at them in disbelief. 2 hours? After a day at the track? And you'd do the same tomorrow? Before they could answer, Lewis pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Angela? I need a suite at the Silverstone Wing tonight. 2 connecting rooms." He listened for a moment. "Yes, it's important. Very important." Another pause. "Thank you." Putting his phone away, Lewis smiled at their surprised faces. "Consider it part of your birthday present," he told Terry. Then, more seriously, "Please, let me do this small thing." As they parted for the night, Lewis hugged Terry again. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Get some rest." Later, as Terry settled into a luxury suite nicer than any place he'd ever stayed, he found himself overwhelmed by the day's events. From the grandstand to the paddock, from lost memories to found connections. He fell asleep, wondering what Lewis was planning, because he recognized that look in Lewis's eyes. It was the same determined expression he'd seen on the face of an 8-year-old boy who declared he would become a Formula One champion someday. And that boy had never made promises he couldn't keep. Lewis Hamilton won the British Grand Prix the next day. The crowd roared as he took the checkered flag, but no one cheered louder than Terry Wilson in the Mercedes garage. "That's my boy," Terry whispered as Lewis performed his victory lap, waving the British flag. During the podium celebration, Lewis dedicated his win to someone special who helped me at the very beginning of my journey. Social media buzzed with speculation about who the mystery person might be. After the celebrations and media duties, Lewis found Terry and Claire waiting in his driver's room. "Congratulations," Terry said, his voice thick with emotion. Lewis grinned. "I had good motivation today." The next morning, Lewis invited Terry to breakfast at a private room in the Silverstone Wing Hotel. When Terry arrived, he was surprised to find not just Lewis, but also 2 other people, a woman and a man in business attire. "Terry, I'd like you to meet Sarah Jackson, my financial advisor, and James Miller, who handles my property investments," Lewis said, gesturing for Terry to sit down. Terry felt suddenly uncomfortable. Was this Lewis's way of offering him money? He'd already decided he wouldn't accept charity, no matter how well-intentioned. "Lewis, if this is what I think," Terry began. "It's not," Lewis interrupted gently. "Just hear us out." Sarah opened her laptop and turned it toward Terry. "Mr. Wilson, Lewis has told us about your background in coaching young drivers. He believes your experience is incredibly valuable." On the screen was a property listing for what looked like an old racing facility. The photos showed a rundown track, weathered buildings, and overgrown grounds. "This is the old Stevenage circuit," Lewis explained, "where I used to watch races as a kid. It's been closed for years, but the land is still there." Terry nodded slowly. "I remember it. But what does this have to do with me?" Lewis leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "I want to buy it and turn it into a racing school for underprivileged kids. A place where talent matters more than money." "That's a wonderful idea," Terry said sincerely. "But I still don't understand my role in this." "I want you to run it," Lewis said simply. I'll provide the funding, but I need someone who knows how to spot and develop talent. Someone who understands that racing isn't just about driving fast. It's about building character. Terry stared at Lewis, speechless. It's not charity, Lewis continued quickly. It's a job offer, a proper salary, benefits, the works. I need someone I trust, someone who taught me the right values from the beginning. James spoke up. There's more to the plan. The property is large enough to include housing units as part of the development. Housing units? Terry asked. Lewis nodded. Affordable housing for families affected by the financial crisis. People who lost their homes, like you did. The pieces were coming together in Terry's mind now. It wasn't just about giving him a job. It was about creating something meaningful, something that addressed the very problems that had derailed his life. This is a big project, Terry said carefully. It would take years. I've got time, Lewis replied with a smile. And so do you. Sarah showed more slides on her laptop. Preliminary designs, budget estimates, timeline projections. It was clear that Lewis had been thinking about this for more than just the past 24 hours. I've been wanting to do something like this for years, Lewis admitted. I just didn't have the right person to make it happen. Now I do. Terry felt overwhelmed. Yesterday, he'd been a supermarket supervisor. Today, he was being offered the chance to return to the world he loved. I don't know what to say, Terry managed. Say you'll at least come look at the property with me, Lewis said. Tomorrow, before I leave for the next race. Terry nodded. I'd like that. Later that day, after Lewis had left for meetings, Terry sat with Claire in their hotel room, trying to process everything. It's incredible, Claire said, like something from a movie. It's too much, Terry replied. Too generous. Claire shook her head firmly. Dad, you spent years helping him when he had nothing. You gave your time, your knowledge, even your money sometimes. Now, he wants to give back. But a whole racing academy? Housing units? Claire took her father's hands. You always taught me that pride can be good, but it can also hold you back. Don't let pride stop you from accepting this opportunity. Next morning, Lewis drove Terry to the old Stevenage circuit in one of his sports cars. The facility was even more rundown in person. Weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt, faded signs, buildings with peeling paint. It needs work, Lewis admitted as they walked the perimeter. But can you see the potential? Terry could. Despite the neglect, the bones of a good facility were there. The layout of the track was still visible, the main building structurally sound. Here, Lewis said, stopping at a spot overlooking the main straight. This is where the housing units could go. 20, maybe 30 families. As Lewis continued to describe his vision, Terry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for himself, but for the next generation of racers who might not get a chance without help. What do you think? Lewis asked finally. Will you help me make this happen? Terry looked out over the abandoned circuit. In his mind's eye, he could already see it transformed, filled with young racers, their families watching from renovated grandstands, a community being rebuilt. Yes, Terry said. I'd be honored. Lewis's smile was radiant. Then, let's get started. Turning a dream into reality took time, even with Lewis Hamilton's resources behind it. The purchase of the Stevenage circuit went through quickly, but permits, planning, and construction were another matter. These things move slowly, Lewis told Terry during one of their weekly video calls. Lewis was in Japan for a race, while Terry was at the circuit, overseeing the initial cleanup work. They move faster when you show up in person, Terry replied with a smile. It's amazing how quickly officials want to help when a 5-time world champion walks into their office. Lewis laughed. 6 times soon, I hope. When Lewis wasn't racing, he was often at the site, working alongside Terry. Workers were surprised the first time Lewis Hamilton showed up in work clothes, helping to clear debris from the old garages. "You don't have to do the physical work," Terry told him. "That's what we're paying the crew for." Lewis shook his head. "This project matters to me. I want my hands in it." The plans evolved as they worked. What started as a simple racing school grew into something more comprehensive. Lewis brought in educational consultants to design classroom spaces where young racers could keep up with their studies. Fitness experts helped create training facilities that rivaled those of professional teams. "We're not just teaching them to drive," Lewis explained during a planning meeting. "We're preparing them for life, whether they become racers or not." The housing component expanded too. Originally planned as basic apartments, the designs now included community spaces, gardens, and a support center where residents could get help finding jobs and managing finances. "This is personal for me," Lewis told reporters when news of the project finally went public. "I was lucky to have people who believed in me when I was young. Not everyone has that support." The media loved the story. The world champion giving back, reunited with his first mentor. But what the cameras didn't capture were the quiet moments. Between Lewis and Terry as they rebuilt not just a racing facility, but their friendship. "I still feel guilty that we lost touch," Lewis admitted one evening as they reviewed plans in the temporary office they'd set up on site. "Life happens," Terry replied. "What matters is that we're here now." Construction moved forward through the winter months. Lewis won his 6th World Championship, dedicating the title to everyone working to give others a second chance. A reference that most missed, but Terry understood completely. By spring, the first housing units were taking shape. Modern, energy-efficient, homes designed to keep costs low for residents. The racing facilities were advancing too. A state-of-the-art karting track with different configurations for various skill levels. "We need a name for this place," Terry said one day as they walked the grounds. Lewis thought for a moment. "What about the Wilson Hamilton Racing Academy?" Terry shook his head. "Hamilton should come first. You're the famous one." "Without you, there would be no Lewis Hamilton World Champion," Lewis insisted. "Your name comes first." It was one argument Lewis didn't win. As summer approached, the first housing unit was ready for occupancy. They had developed an application process for families affected by the financial crisis, giving priority to those with children interested in motorsport. "Who should be the first resident?" Lewis asked during a planning meeting. Terry had been thinking about this for months. "It should be someone who represents what this place stands for. Second chances. New beginnings." Lewis nodded slowly. "I think I know just the person." The next day, Lewis took Terry to the completed unit. A 2-bedroom apartment with modern appliances filled with natural light from large windows that overlooked the racing circuit. "What do you think?" Lewis asked, watching Terry inspect the space. "It's perfect," Terry said. "Whoever lives here will be very lucky." Lewis handed Terry a key. "It's yours, if you want it." Terry stared at the key in his palm. "Lewis, I can't accept this. I'm already getting a salary for running the academy." "You're not just staff, Terry. You're the heart of this project." Lewis looked around the apartment. "Besides, the director should live on site. It's practical." Terry considered this. Living here would end his 2-hour commute from Claire's house. He could be present for early morning and evening activities at the academy. "I'd have to contribute," Terry said firmly. "Pay rent, like any other resident." Lewis smiled. "I expected you'd say that. Sarah has already worked out a reasonable figure based on your salary. Proper contract, everything official." Terry felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For 8 years, he had lived in someone else's space, careful not to take up too much room, always aware of being a guest. Having his own place again would mean independence, dignity. "Thank you," Terry said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "So you'll take it?" Louis asked. Terry nodded, squeezing the key in his hand. "Yes. It's time I had my own home again." 2 weeks later, Terry moved from Claire's spare room to his new apartment. Claire and her family helped, making a day of it with a small celebration once everything was unpacked. "Are you sure you'll be okay here alone, Dad?" Claire asked as evening approached. Terry looked around his new home, then out the window at the racing circuit where lights were being installed along the main straight. "I won't be alone," he said. "This place is going to be full of life soon." That night, after everyone had left, Terry sat on his balcony watching the sunset over the Uichara Seam track. In just a few months, young racers would be learning the skills he had once taught Louis. Families who had lost everything, just as he had, would be rebuilding their lives in this community, and he would be here to help them, just as Louis had helped him. Full circle, Terry thought, smiling as the first stars appeared above the circuit. Life had come full circle. 1 year after Terry and Louis's chance reunion at Silverstone, the Wilson Hamilton Racing Academy was ready for its grand opening. The transformation was remarkable. From abandoned circuit to state-of-the-art facility, from overgrown weeds to pristine asphalt, from broken dreams to new beginnings, all 30 housing units were completed and occupied by families selected from hundreds of applications. Each family had a story similar to Terry's. Hard-working people who had lost their homes during economic downturns, now given a fresh start. Opening day dawned clear and bright. A stage had been set up near the starting grid, with chairs for special guests and a standing area for the press. News crews from around the world had come to cover the event, partly because of Lewis Hamilton's involvement, but also because the Academy represented something hopeful in a world that needed good news. Terry stood in his apartment, adjusting, his tie in the mirror. The face looking back at him had changed over the past year. There was color in his cheeks again, a sparkle in his eyes. But there was also something else, a tiredness that wouldn't go away, a pain in his side that he'd been ignoring for months. Just stress, he told himself, swallowing 2 painkillers. Today's a big day. There was a knock at his door. Louis stood outside, dressed in a sharp suit, but without his usual designer logos or jewelry. Today wasn't about fashion or fame. Ready for the big moment? Louis asked with a smile that faded as he looked more closely at Terry. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." "Just nervous," Terry assured him. "Let's go make history." The crowd that had gathered exceeded their expectations. Along with the EE, press, and local officials, dozens of families with children lined the edges of the track. Some held signs welcoming the new academy. Others simply stared in wonder at Lewis Hamilton standing just feet away. As Terry took his place on the stage beside Louis, he scanned the audience. Claire and her family were in the front row, beaming with pride. Behind them were many of the Itri-Efi, families who now lived in the housing units. And at the very back, Terry spotted a group he hadn't expected. Former colleagues from the Rye House Kart circuit, some of whom he hadn't seen in decades. Louis stepped to the microphone, and the crowd fell silent. "Welcome to the Wilson Hamilton Racing Academy," he began. "This is a dream that started 30 years ago, though I didn't know it at the time." Louis told the story of how Terry had discovered him at Rye House, how he'd coached him for free, believing in his talent when Louis had nothing but dreams. Success in racing isn't just about having the fastest car or the most money, Lewis continued. It's about having people who believe in you, who see your potential even when you can't see it yourself. Lewis gestured to the Academy buildings behind him. This place exists to find those special young people, the ones with fire in their hearts and determination in their eyes. We don't care about their background or how much money their parents have. We care about their character, their work ethic, and their passion. Terry felt a wave of emotion as Lewis described the Academy's mission: to provide not just racing instruction, but a complete education, to build character as well as racing, skills, to create not just champions, but good human beings. And now, Lewis said, I'd like to introduce the man who will make this vision a reality. The man who taught me everything I know about racing and life. My first mentor and my friend, Terry Wilson. The applause was thunderous as Terry stepped forward. For a moment, he felt lightheaded, the pain in his side flaring sharply. But he steadied himself against the podium and smiled at the crowd. 30 years ago, Terry began, a small boy came to Rye House Kart Circuit with a second-hand kart and a big dream. Today, that boy is a 7-time world champion. Terry gestured toward the Academy buildings. This place isn't about creating the next Lewis Hamilton. It's about giving every child the same chance Lewis had, to pursue their passion regardless of their circumstances. As Terry continued speaking, he spotted a young girl in the crowd. She was perhaps 8 years old, with dark, curly hair and intense eyes that reminded him of Lewis at that age. She was watching him with complete focus, hanging on his every word. Today, we welcome our first class of 30 young racers, Terry announced, selected not for their family connections or their financial resources, but for their talent, determination, and character. Lewis joined Terry at the microphone for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Together, they officially opened the Wilson Hamilton Racing Academy as photographers captured the moment for front pages around the world. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed to tour the facilities, Terry found himself drawn to the young girl he had noticed during his speech. She was standing beside a worn cart that had seen better days, her mother hovering nervously nearby. "Hello," Terry said, crouching down to eye level. "I'm Terry. What's your name?" "Maya," she replied without a hint of shyness. "Are you really going to teach us to race?" "That's the plan," Terry smiled. "Have you raced before?" Maya nodded. 3 times, but we had to stop because—" She glanced at her mother, who looked embarrassed. "Because we lost our home last year," her mother explained quietly. "The company I worked for went bankrupt after the pandemic." Terry felt an immediate connection. "You're one of the families in the new housing units?" The woman nodded. "We moved in last week. It's been life-changing." Terry turned back to Maya. "Would you like me to take a look at your cart? I might have some tips." Maya's eyes lit up as Terry examined her cart, pointing out adjustments that might help her go faster. The intensity of her questions, the quick way she absorbed information, it all reminded him so strongly of young Lewis. As they talked, Terry felt the pain in his side intensify. He winced, trying to hide his discomfort. "Are you okay, Mr. Wilson?" Maya asked, noticing despite his efforts. "Just an old racing injury," Terry lied, forcing a smile. Later, as the day's events wound down, Lewis found Terry sitting alone in the brand-new classroom, catching his breath. "We did it," Lewis said, taking the seat beside him. "This place is going to change lives." Terry nodded. "I met a girl today, Maya. She reminds me so much of you at that age." Lewis smiled. "I saw you with her. I thought the same thing. Terry hesitated, then made a decision. It was time to be honest. Louis, there's something I need to tell you, he said slowly. I've been having some health problems. Pain, fatigue. Louis's expression grew concerned. For how long? A few months now, Terry admitted. I finally saw a doctor last week. He took a deep breath. It's cancer, Louis. Stage 2 pancreatic cancer. Louis stared at him, the color draining from his face. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I didn't want to cast a shadow over this project, Terry explained. Over today. But there are treatments, right? Louis asked urgently. Surgery? Chemotherapy? Terry nodded. The doctor says I have options, good ones. But it's going to be a fight. Louis reached over and gripped Terry's hand tightly. Then we'll fight, he said fiercely. Together. Just like we did when I was learning to race. Just like we did to build this place. Terry looked out the classroom window at the karting track where Maya was still examining her kart, her face set with determination. I need to be here for these kids, Terry said quietly. Especially for Maya. She needs a coach who believes in her, just like you did. And you will be, Louis insisted. We'll get you the best doctors, the best treatment, whatever it takes. As the sun began to set over the Wilson Hamilton Racing Academy, Terry realized that his journey with Louis wasn't ending. It was entering a new chapter. Once again, they would face a challenge together. And regardless of what happened, Terry knew his legacy would continue through this place, through children like Maya, through the second chances given to families who had lost everything. Life had indeed come full circle, and the circle would continue, unbroken. Thanks for joining me. Till the end, let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also, make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love Lewis Hamilton. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this heartwarming story of friendship and second chances. See you in the next one.